Hey, we're gonna go back to chapter 1 of part 3. Okay, here we go. The professor woke them early. It was barely light and the sun had yet to show itself. Pockets of mist lay among the vivid blue hills. I love the description in this book, I just gotta say. Pockets of mist lay among the vivid blue hills. Think about that, so beautiful. He said quietly, "It is imperative that we get through the forest of the tree squeaks before they wake up. If they see us, they'll warn the proc. Let's go. Keep very quiet." He led the way down the hill, and the wiffle bird flew onto Tom's shoulder. "Professor," whispered Ben, "there's a road just over there." The professor nodded. "Probably the main highway. What a bit of luck." The sky was beginning to redden. The professor quickened his pace. They reached the road and discovered that it was made of shell-pink flowers, clustered so tightly together that they were like a carpet. A signpost stood on a grassy bank. One arm pointed to the trees and read, "To the forest of the tree squeaks." Another arm, below it, pointed in the same direction. It read, "To the palace." "Not long now," the professor murmured happily. "Let's take off our shoes. We'll make less noise." The road was cool and springy beneath their feet. Tom noticed some white star-shaped blossoms growing in a hedge with huge berries hanging beneath them. He tugged the professor's sleeve and asked if he could eat some more. The professor picked a berry and tasted it. "Delicious," he pronounced. "Shut your mouth," muttered the wiffle bird. "Why did she say that?" asked Lindy. "She's saying we really must be quiet," whispered the professor, and he handed Tom a fistful of berries. "Yes, but does she have to be so rude about it?" Lindy picked up one of the berries and popped it into her mouth. By the time they reached the entrance to the forest, everyone had eaten a scrumptious breakfast. Their first impression of the forest was that it was dark and gloomy. But as their eyes adjusted to the light, they saw that it was unusually colorful. The plum-colored trees had brown, gnarled trunks. Most of them were embraced by a vivid pink ivy, growing and twining around the tall columns and twisted limbs. Garlands of honey-creamed flowers hung from the branches, linking one tree to another. The floor was mossy and bedded with ferns the color of amethyst. Huge pearl-white and crimson orchids grew at the side of the road, which pointed straight as an arrow into the dark interior. Then they saw the eyes. There were thousands of them, large, unblinking, tortoise-shell yellow orbs, staring down through the leaves from every part of the forest. It was such a chilling sight that the professor and the children came to a complete halt. Gradually they were able to discern the bodies of the tree squeaks, which were hanging upside down by their tails from every tree. They were like little russet-colored monkeys, with wings folded at their sides. Lindy took the professor's hand. "Are they awake or asleep?" she whispered. "Asleep, I think. They have a strange characteristic of being able to sleep with their eyes open. Come on." They moved forward again, clutching their shoes in their hands. The forest was full of soft rustling sounds and an occasional tiny squeak. The professor and Lindy led the way, with Ben and Tom and the wiffle bird bringing up the rear. Suddenly Ben startled everyone by giving a clear, loud hiccup. He dropped his shoes and clapped his hand across his mouth. The professor spun around. Ben's eyes were wide with horror. His shoulders heaved as he hiccuped again. The wiffle bird nervously fluffed out her feathers. "Shut your mouth," she mumbled. "Shh," hissed the professor. Everyone looked up at the tree squeaks. They had not moved. The professor picked up Ben's shoes and motioned to the children to follow him. They had only gone a few more paces when Lindy made a high, squeaky sound like a mouse with a bad attack of the sneezes. She looked panic-stricken and started to apologize, but all that came out was another squeaking hiccup. She could not stop. The professor hurriedly pulled out his big spotted handkerchief. Lindy grabbed it and promptly dropped one of her shoes. Everyone tried to do something at once. Lindy stuffed the handkerchief into her mouth. Ben bent to pick up Lindy's shoe, still keeping one hand across his mouth. The professor caught his umbrella handle in his pocket, and Tom suddenly gave such a loud hic that the surprised wiffle bird took off. The professor dived for her and caught her just as she was flying past him. His umbrella and the shoes scattered in all directions. "Dear wiffle bird," he breathed fervently, "please don't make a sound." By now all three children were hiccuping violently. The professor signaled for everyone to stand still. He stroked the wiffle bird and looked up at the tree squeaks. In spite of the noise, they remained undisturbed. "I'm going to tie your shoes together so that you can hang them around your neck," he said. "That will leave your hands free to cover your mouths." He gathered up the shoes and gave a pair to each child. "Now then, we will start again. Follow me and please try to keep quiet," at which point he gave the loudest hiccup the children had ever heard. The professor looked so startled it was all they could do to keep from laughing. The professor lifted up the collar of his jacket and pulled the coat above his head. Muffled sounds came from beneath it as he struggled to stem the attack. The children waited, twitching and shaking, trying desperately to rid themselves of their own fearful spasms. Presently, the professor emerged from beneath his coat, his face beet red. He gasped, "We should never have eaten those berries. Take a deep breath and hold it as long as you can." The children did as they were told until they thought their lungs would burst. Then they carefully exhaled. To their surprise, the hiccups seemed to have gone. They all looked at each other. Everything was silent again. Not a sound, not a single peep came from any of them. They smiled with relief. "Everybody okay now?" the professor whispered. They nodded. "All right, let's get out of here." They moved on. Without warning, each one of them let forth an explosive, unguarded hic at exactly the same moment. The noise was so loud that it seemed to split the forest wide open. The result was disastrous. Every tree squeak rose up into the air, squealing, squawking, and screeching, and the entire place rang and throbbed with the terrible sound. Lindy screamed, Tom covered his ears, the wiffle bird cried, "Mayday!" and the professor grumbled, "Fiddlesticks! Fiddlesticks!" Ben watched the black cloud of tree squeaks swirling above them. To his amazement, he realized they were screaming, "People! People! People! People!" as loud as they could. The Proc and every other creature in the land could not fail to hear such a warning. The wiffle bird's voice cut through the frightful din. "Cheer up!" she squawked. "Well, that's a stupid thing to say," shouted Ben angrily. The professor hugged Lindy close because she was sobbing with fright. "Cheer up! Up, up! Cheer! That's it!" he cried. "Let's cheer! Let's drown out the noise! I refuse to be intimidated by this racket." "What's intimidated?" asked Lindy. "Oh, never mind, darling. Just sing. Sing as loud as you can. All of you. Remember when we went to our picnic and sang in the rain? Sing louder than that." The professor started to sing a rousing march. The children joined in, stomping and banging their shoes together, making so much noise that the wiffle bird got quite excited and flew around, shrieking ferociously, "Shoot the works!" The terrible clamor above them diminished, and their hiccups grew less, as the professor, waving his umbrella like a baton, led the way through the forest. Quite suddenly they emerged from the trees and into the daylight. The morning sun was so bright that it took a moment or two to get used to it. They continued singing until they were well away from the forest. The sound of the tree squeaks subsided and gradually faded away altogether. The professor sank into the grass. "My great godfathers," he said with feeling, "I have never been through such a frightful experience. Those miserable tree squeaks and those ghastly hiccups." He clasped a hand to his stomach. "Was it the berries that made us hiccup?" asked Tom. "Of course," replied the professor. "That's what the wiffle bird was going on about when we were eating. When she said 'shut your mouth,' she meant 'don't eat.'" Ben stroked the wiffle bird's beautiful feathers. "You always know the right thing to tell us, don't you, wiffle bird?" Wiffle bird made her humming sounds and strutted around proudly. The professor said, "I really must pay more attention to her." That's the second time I have missed the sense of what she was saying, and both times we got into trouble." He prodded Tom. "There's a lesson in that, young man. Learn to listen well when people are talking. First, it's a great art, and second, it's quite possible that when people say one thing, they mean another." He rubbed his forehead warily and looked at the children. "You know, we haven't a hope now of reaching the palace without trouble of some kind. I'm quite sure the Proc heard the tree squeaks and is already making plans to stop us." "But we're going on, aren't we?" asked Ben hopefully. "I'd like to." "That is, if you all agree," said the professor. "We're really so close." "I say it's the Proc or us," Tom declared. "How do you feel about it, Lindy?" "Oh, I feel fine," she said in a small voice. "I just wish we could stop being surprised all the time." The professor nodded understandingly and looked around. The region was very different from anything they'd ever seen before. A white desert with cherry red cactus plants growing out of the sandy ground. There were small foothills in the immediate area, and beyond them, the giant mountains and the Wangdoodle's palace. The professor got to his feet. "Well, if we're going to continue, we'd best be on our way." He strode off at a good pace, and the children followed. Okay, that brings us to Chapter 2 of Part 3. And we will find out what happens tomorrow or next time. Okay, bye.